At Southern Seminary, when I first came, it was a transition period. I came 5 years after Al Mohler became president of Southern Seminary. But unfortunately, we had professors, and we still do, who, again, think that they can teach the apostles and the prophets how to get it right. And it's
incredible hubris, isn't it?
It is. It's arrogance. Now, there's a case in my department, in the Old Testament department, where we hired someone. We either hired him in very late 2017 or very early 2018. So this is fairly recent. Mm-hmm. He believes that the Old Testament teaches mythology.
Mythology. So none of it's true.
None of it's true.
It's just poetic. And Al Mohler hired this guy.
Oh, yes. And a dean knew all about this. And I wrote up some notes on this and said, look at this. This is a serious problem. We should not be hiring someone like this. He knew this information.
And still did it.
And he still hired him.
And so denying the inerrancy of Scripture is something that is routinely happening in the school where you've taught.
Yeah. Now, they won't say that out loud.
They won't admit it?
No. They will say they can sign the statement. Don't worry. There's a statement we have to sign affirming inerrancy. People will say anything in order to teach at an institution. This goes on all the time. It really does.
This is a very unusual controversy that we're having with the social justice movement, because historically, when we've had false doctrine or false teaching coming into the church, it's usually been against the Trinity. They deny the cardinal doctrines. These people are not doing that, at least now, but they have a socialistic, neo-Marxist social policy.
So I don't think it's possible in a Christian context to talk about reconciliation without likewise talking about justice. And we are working together, living together in love and Spirit-empowered love. That means we care about things like economic inequality and these sorts of things. That doesn't mean you're justified by economic equality, but that does mean that the gospel transforms us holistically.
Like Jarvis Williams, who basically preaches a critical race theory infused gospel, where he takes critical race theory principles and then he takes the Bible and he finds parallels and he creates his own racial reconciliation. That's what he calls it. And he said it's part of the gospel, but it's not. If you read what he actually says, it requires you to do things like, take down white Jesus and platform minorities because they're not being platformed, or if you're white, you have to shut up and listen to other perspectives because you're not able to ascertain the truth the same way. And he incorporates this all into his racial reconciliation doctrine. You have Walter Strickland at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, who in the past few years has preached a liberation theology.
Dr. Cone, he opened my eyes. Dr. Cone really allowed me to see a new space, a new avenue to allow the gospel to be made manifest. I think the evangelical will do well to hear the voice of Dr. Cone in drawing us towards the reality that the gospel, the resurrection of Christ, has implications for the here and now.
A good number of years ago, I was reading books and listening to conference speakers and reading articles online, and I could just sense that there was something that wasn't right as it pertains to the issues of social justice and the gospel of Jesus Christ. As time would progress, I just couldn't seem to connect the dots. And one evening, Vodi Bakum was over at my home. We're having a meal, and one thing led to the next, and there was a conversation that developed around the table. And it was through that conversation that Vodi helped me connect the dots to what's actually happening today. And it's a very progressive movement. It is definitely an agenda. It operates on the framework of postmodernism. And it is a threat upon the church, and it's a threat upon the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Whiteness has caused blindness of heart. Whiteness has caused blindness of heart.
There is therefore now much condemnation to those who are in the woke church. That needs to be the new translation of Romans 8:1, because the apostles never thought of anything like this. It would have been disaster to the early church for them to have believed any of this. If you allow external sources to define what justice is, you're going to end up fundamentally changing the Bible's teaching about who God is and what He's done, and replace it with a man-derived understanding of what justice is that is primarily economic.
The gospel is not simply a message for the afterlife. We see it modeled perfectly in the life of Jesus. He met economic needs and also social needs. He healed the sick, challenged corruption in leaders and systems. He honored the poor and the outcast. Wherever Jesus went, holistic restoration was taking place.
We come with the message of the gospel, and we come with a cup of water as well. We come with care and compassion because we love people just as Jesus did. But we don't confuse the two. We don't say that that cup of water is the gospel.
When it comes to society, the church has often separated the gospel from social issues, causing many believers to be apathetic in our engagement in our neighborhoods. You see, the gospel demands the church engage holistically with our cities.
I've been going through the process of church planting in the Southern Baptist Convention. I'm up here in Washington State, and up until very recently, Washington State, the Northwest Baptist Convention had their own church planting arm that worked in conjunction with the North American Missions Board. Over my church planting journey, that has changed, and now the North American Missions Board has taken over operations. We were the last state to be divided like that.
Under Kevin Ezell, they began to take more controls and make more decision making and moving it from the field into the offices in Alpharetta. And we wanted to partner with the North American Mission Board, which we had agreements to do that, but we weren't going to relinquish our mission field. We had been started in 1836 before the Southern Baptist Convention had even formed. And so, as a North American Mission Board tried to get an agreement, a new agreement, a different agreement than the one we were operating under, Kevin Ezell began to make threats. And ultimately, he lied in writing against me, and he made a bribe. In essence, what he did, he weaponized Southern Baptist mission dollars to have me removed. That's unethical, it's unbiblical, and it's illegal.
I decided to talk to the head of church planting, Dahadi Lewis. And so I just emailed him with some honest questions. I was seeing some of these more social gospel, more it's about our works more than it is about our preaching. And so I just emailed them like, look, I want some clarity on this. And the responses I got were more concerning than they were alleviating. I was being told that I was preaching a half gospel if I was preaching a gospel of salvation of someone's soul. When you tell someone that they have a partial gospel or a half gospel, you're saying it's false. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk a little bit about the gospel that they're encouraging us to teach. The element of the gospel apparently that's being missed is the economic, social, financial, I apologize, I said economic and financial, but the different pillars of society that have been broken and how we need to restore them. We need to engage in holistic restoration. What was being taught was that the gospel, this work of restoration, is something that we, me and you, all of us, do right here, right now, in this earth. Like we can almost create utopia here and now. And for anyone that doubts that, again, he was gracious enough to send me handouts from the Send Network, to give me links to their resources, to give me their value and mission booklet. What I'm being taught, how I'm being encouraged to teach, doesn't line up with the Bible. And yes, Mr. Lewis was generous enough to answer some of my questions, but what he gave me was adding things to the gospel that aren't supposed to be there. Have you ever heard the saying, save the soul and the rest will follow? This, unfortunately, characterizes the historic actions of many American evangelicals, we've reduced the gospel to the Great Commission, go therefore and make disciples, and the Great Commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Yet in all our evangelistic zeal, we have tragically missed a key component of the gospel: restoration through the great requirement. We see the great requirement in Micah 6:8. Mankind, he has told each of you what is good, and what it is the Lord requires of you: to act justly, to love faithfulness, and to walk humbly with your God. God requires us to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with Him. The great requirement does not happen separately from our commission and commandment.
I have had people within my own community say, well, this is not going to impact us because we have a solid confession. The problem is when the seminaries who are training the next generation of people who will stand behind the pulpits are teaching them that this is a proper way to even interpret the confessions, that's the next generation that's going to be coming up to take your place. So you might think right now, I can't see us coming into our fellowship. It comes in with a rapidity that would be surprising to you.
I've come to understand more and more that my perspective is not the perspective of my African American brothers and sisters, or my Hispanic brothers and sisters, my Asian brothers and sisters. They really do see life differently. They're operating out of a different paradigm, a different context that's very different than mine. So I think one of the things that white evangelicals in particular have got to do is become better listeners. In addition to that, we've got to be willing to surrender power. We even need to be willing to surrender leadership at the table if we're really going to make progress and really help our brothers and sisters understand we see them on an equal plane with ourselves.
I think many Christians who are well-intended in their desire to uphold the authority of the text slip into a desire of protecting the text from misinterpretation, which they are trying to then read the Bible so objectively that they, because they cannot escape their own cultural trappings, assume their own cultural realities into this reality of inerrancy, and then we come up with this very simplistic reading of the text. Oftentimes the pattern is for authors to come to publishers, but I think the publisher needs to have a missiological disposition to go in and finding these voices that are drastically underrepresented ideologically.
You know, people sometimes speak of hermeneutics as if it has principles that are set in stone. But is hermeneutics static, or is it dynamic in the sense that it can change as methods of interpretation are adapted to different cultural contexts?
I think we do better when we sit down to read the Bible and we have brothers and sisters coming from all different ethnicities, all different socioeconomic standings, because they're going to have insights into this infallible, inerrant text that I, for example, will miss.
I mean, a lot of Christians, I think, suffer from hermeneutical solipsism. They assume that their interpretation is the only one that exists, or the only valid one. But when you realize there are insights you can get from different cultures, and even just from people in general, that their own life experience will bring something to the table. We do need to be prepared to accept that, our way, the Anglican way, the Presbyterian way, the male way, the white male way, the Northern Hemisphere way, or whatever the way is you've been ingrained, is not the only way, and you can learn a lot and at least appreciate the people who are other, who are different to you. And that's in the global Church of Christ. That is what we should be doing.
The reason that social justice is in vogue today, the reason that you have evangelicals who were once considered to be the most conservative, the most straight-laced, if you will, now employing the tactics of social justice, is because the social justice movement is very lucrative, it's very powerful, and he who controls the narrative controls the power and controls the agenda. And so this is a massive movement. And so what you have now is you have, in many ways, the evangelical circle of social justice is really using that same type of methodology, which was connected to the methodology of cultural Marxism and classic Marxism from the past. So all I'm saying is that the reason that these individuals are using this type of agenda is because they notice a shift in the culture. They noticed a shift in the dynamics, if you will, of American culture. And so how do you tap into that and bring those people to your side, if you will? Well, let's just be honest. It's what we might call gender pragmatism, class pragmatism. And so it's really pragmatism that's repackaged. So it's social justice pragmatism. It's using social justice machine in a pragmatic way to be attractive to people so that you can control this whole movement.
I want our faculty and our students to be aware of critical race theory and what Deuce said a moment ago, where they raise really good questions, where they expose underlying hidden aspects of racism. I'm thankful for that. Again, as an overall framework and ideology, I think it comes up short. But that doesn't mean everything that they say is wrong. In a number of instances, it's very clear it overlaps with Revelation and what God's Word says about these issues. It just simply highlights them in our particular context and kind of, well, yeah, I can see how that, the Bible's talking about that right over here. So I do think that has been helpful.
If you live in the middle of a place that is just overwhelmingly white, there's hardly any people of color where you live at all in your town. This sounds like a harsh thing to say, but you probably should not adopt a non-white kid. If you're going to raise kids like white kids, you should adopt white kids.
Christianity and race in America were intertwined at its inception. Because Christianity was the thing used to be able to say, how can we enslave these people, yet evangelize them? And so how is it that we can construct or imagine a faith that sets somebody's soul free but keeps their body belonging to us? But the issue is that as that gospel was preached to slaves to keep them in check, the people who were propagating that gospel to them actually took it on themselves. And so now we have a gospel that's a half gospel that says, your soul can be free, but your body doesn't matter. So then, the weighty matters of law, KJ, get relegated to, piety. And so then justice gets cut out from the idea of the chaos or the justice righteousness sort of two-parted reality of the gospel and what it does.
These are not sins that are of what God defines. They're sins that the world defines. So that's why it's pagan religion, because you have to go back to the altar of Baal, so to speak. You're not going to the cross of Christ, because Christ says it is finished. God will never judge anyone in eternity on the principles of intersectionality. But you will stand before God and answer for partiality.
And I think that oftentimes we talk about sin or we talk about this whole idea of the gospel solely as the goal of Christianity is a fight for perfection instead of a fight against isolation, right? It's because the gospel brings us together, but it seems like the wall has been torn down in Ephesians chapter 2 and 11, and we're spending all our time building the wall back up as believers, and that is what's causing the division.
Majority culture will often see themselves as the dominant group in the text. What if whiteness is the Gentiles? Because so often it is, right?
Exactly. Southern Baptists need to understand what the issues are. And it pains them to think that there are some in their leadership that have gone off the track, that have gone a direction that is unbiblical, unsound in doctrine, which I certainly would say that social justice is unsound in doctrine. After several years on the board, I did become concerned that while there was a lot of emphasis on the inerrancy of Scripture, there was seemingly less emphasis on the sufficiency of Scripture. The seminary was moving in a direction of support for the woke movement, that social justice was gaining a foothold. I obtained a copy of some class notes from Dr. Jarvis Williams' class. And if anybody were to read those class notes, it would be very clear to them that Dr. Williams was teaching CRT, critical race theory, and intersectionality. When, again, in a trustee meeting, questioning Dr. Moeller about that, his response was, well, we're not teaching critical race theory, we're teaching about it. Now that's concerning to me because when I was a student at Southeastern back in the 80s, one of the issues was the historical critical method of interpretation of the Old Testament. And the president of Southeastern at the time had stated that we're not teaching the historical critical method, we're teaching about it. But I was in the classroom having JEPD crammed down my throat. So I knew that that wasn't true. Then on top of that, we have the provost, Dr. Matt Hall, going on a podcast stating unequivocally that he was a racist and that he would be a racist until he died because of his skin color. And this is not something that I believe that our students at Southern Seminary need to be taught. Dr. Moeller, initially with Matt Hall, his response at that point was to defend Matt's credentials and qualifications, which were never in question. The man is eminently qualified. He was gracious. He was given the opportunity to explain his statement. And his answer essentially was, I probably should have chosen my words more wisely. But to my knowledge, there was never any time that he backed down from those words or changed those words.
The old Al Mohler would fire the new Al Mohler, you know, based on what he's doing. I hate to make an analogy like this, but it kind of reminds me of that famous country western song that I love with Glenn Campbell, the Rhinestone Cowboy. Remember, he was not a real cowboy, and I love the line. It says, I'm in a load of compromising on the road to my horizon, and I'm going to go where the lights are bright and shiny. Rhinestone Cowboy. And that's the image that comes to my mind now when I think of him. It's been so disappointing.
The reason that you have people who are afraid to speak up is because many of these people, if they speak up, they're going to lose their jobs. You have people who think if they speak up, that they're going to fracture relationships.
We terminated several professors. Those terminations are, I think, directly related to the position the seminary is taking on social justice. One of the professors terminated, obviously, was one of the professors who signed the statement on social justice, and two of those professors were clearly in opposition to the seminary's current position on social justice. The reasons for the terminations were an anticipated financial downturn due to the pandemic. It wasn't long after these professors were terminated that new professors were hired. It doesn't look good to say we're firing 7 professors because we're not going to be able to afford to pay them and then go hire several more. And what we were doing, I believe, is using the pandemic almost as an excuse or a cover for removing people from the faculty that we didn't want. There's certainly a point at which we need to be very, very concerned about the direction that our seminaries are going in terms of social justice. The fact that someone says it's not happening does not necessarily mean that's true. And what you have to do is you have to research. All you have to do is go look for this stuff. It's out there. The videos are out there, the panels are out there, the statements are out there, the documents are out there.
I find myself unemployed. Then I tried to begin a ministry called the Church Strengthening Network, and I tried to get started, and all of a sudden I find out that Kevin Ezel, the president of North American Mission Board, has actually called Jimmy Scroggins, the pastor of Family Church in West Palm Beach, and got Jimmy to call to actually get me off a program sponsored by the Florida Baptist Convention. Again, that's illegal activity. He can't prevent me from working, and actually it reveals his character. I'm having a hard time providing for my family because Kevin didn't leave it in Maryland. He kept chasing me. Ultimately, I didn't file a lawsuit for about another 14 months, and I didn't even have an attorney. And yet they had attorneys, and again, threatening me, trying to silence me, those kinds of things.
So you basically, you ended up filing a lawsuit after almost 2 years, just in self-defense.
That's right.
kind of we're left with no choice.
We believe the law is on our side and the truth is on our side. We first filed in Mississippi District Court, Federal Court, and we won several decisions, and then ultimately they put together some false affidavits by the CFO of the Baptist Convention of Maryland, Delaware, and the CFO of North American Mission Board to deceive the judge. There's been so much money. They've gotten so good at handing out the money, and they have bought silence everywhere. I mean, Kevin Ezell, he's using entire entities, $130 million a year, to buy silence in the midst of irrefutable failure at every level.
Let me read for you. This is in 2015. The George Soros Foundation said this: Reverend Russell Moore, head of the public policy for the Southern Baptist Convention, and then they quote Russell Moore as saying that evangelicals should be the ones calling the rest of the world to remember human dignity and the image of God, especially for those fleeing murderous Islamic radical jihadis. Now, so Russell Moore is forwarding immigrants from Muslim countries coming to the United States. There is a link to George Soros. Now, why would George Soros want to fund Russell Moore? And why would his organization be bragging that this is what Russell Moore said with our money? Russell Moore has taken money from this individual. Russell Moore has also taken money from the Democracy Fund. $50,000 went to the MLK 50 conference. And why would the Democracy Fund, an openly leftist organization, want to fund an evangelical conference that gave Southern Baptist students at seminary credits to attend?
When you look at what's happening right now on a global scale with this mass influx and surge to the borders, who is it that's participating in this? It's folks that are part of the Evangelical Immigration Table. And the Evangelical Immigration Table was something that was actually sourced from the National Immigration Forum. The National Immigration Forum was fully funded and as well was given a massive $2.3 million gift from Open Societies foundations.
I worked for the Ted Cruz campaign in 2016. Him and Mike Huckabee were the only two Southern Baptists that ran for president in that cycle. They weren't invited by Russell Moore to come and speak to the convention. But two Catholics, Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, were the only two invited. Now, why were they invited? Because they were the two most open borders candidates in the race. All right. And why wasn't Ted Cruz invited? Because he wasn't an open borders candidate. That's why Southern Baptist wasn't invited to come and address his own denomination while he's running for president. This is not new.
With us today, one of my heroes in the faith, my fellow Mississippian, Dr. John Perkins. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Perkins.
He's spoken with Russell Moore at the MLK 50 conference for the ERLC. And he says that
when Martin Luther King was doing his March on Washington and all that, we was communists. And I never would have thought that I lived to see us here tonight, looking like we're looking tonight.
So you have the ERLC and Russell Moore. There is as much social gospel as there is biblical gospel in what I hear coming out of him. He is promoting things that are undermining the gospel. And if it's not already another gospel, will lead to another gospel.
Russell Moore and Albert Mohler both made statements in October 2014 to the effect that counseling to get people out of homosexuality to heterosexuality had problems, that it wasn't, they implied that if you were to be strictly biblical, you'd be doing something else other than that. At the same time that the gay community is pushing bans on counseling and on any kind of therapy to help people come out of homosexuality into heterosexuality, the church is itself implicitly endorsing those bans.
It's agreeing with it.
They're agreeing with them because they're saying theologically that their view as a church actually aligns with them. Because ultimately what they're saying is that God does make some people that way, or even though they won't say that directly, they'll say some people are created and God just does not have the intent for them ever to be heterosexual. And then in 2018, I submitted a resolution to the Southern Baptist Convention saying that we should support counseling to help people who want to go from homosexuality to heterosexuality.
Seems reasonable.
It's biblical. When I submitted that resolution, of course, it was killed in committee, so it couldn't go to the floor. One of the things that they made very clear was that I was not supposed to talk about that issue, and I also was not supposed to say anything that would appear like criticism of Al Mohler or Russell Moore, which meant that I really had no way of countering the poor theology that they were spreading on this issue of same-sex attracted Christianity. It's a ticking time bomb, because ultimately the truth will come out eventually. People will realize that the gay movement lied and that people are not born gay. People can change. People are going to realize that the Bible is clear and the Bible was right, and it all made sense from the very beginning, that there were two types of bodies designed. There was male and female, and that they were made for a certain design and a certain purpose. And so once people realize that truth, ultimately, all of these people who played all of these games to try to minimize it or to try to camouflage it or to try to accommodate it or to succumb to it, they all lied. They were all part of the big lie.
We can be faithfully single, or we can be faithfully married based on God's definition of marriage. So luckily, I can actually fulfill either of those vocations, whether I'm attracted to men or women or both or neither or potted plants. Like, my attractional patterns don't actually matter very much.
I don't minister out of rigid categories of gay and straight. I think those only contribute maybe to premature labeling. Like, if I'm not gay, then I'm straight. If I'm not straight, then I'm gay. Ooh, let's back off of that a little bit. Let's just talk about other ways to think about your identity and to describe your same-sex sexuality. I'm not setting this up as you got to make people choose in Christ or gay. I'm not doing that.
Nate Collins was a student at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, where Al Mohler is the president. And Nate Collins organized a conference called Revoice, which was dedicated to the normalization of homosexual orientation.
I'm gay. I'm celibate. When was the last time I went on a date? Like 4 or 5 years ago. I'm 29. I'm a youth pastor in New Jersey.
I'm Nick. I'm straight, and I'm also a youth pastor in New Jersey.
We became a family and then became a household. We're planning on sharing life together for the rest of our lives, which we're not totally sure what that looks like. Obviously, Nick is straight, and he does plan on getting married. When he has a wife one day, she'll make those decisions with us.
Al Mohler is not completely guiltless when it comes to this, because he has, without endorsing it explicitly, he has given cover by the statements that he has made that are erroneous. At a Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission conference, Al Mohler repented, used that word, for denying same-sex orientation.
What?
So he believes that homosexuality is an innate orientation.
He repented for having taken a biblical position on sexual behavior?
Yes.
He repented for being
of
biblical. I was particularly shocked. How could a man with this knowledge of Scripture that has written X, Y, and Z that is so good do this, jettisoning his biblical view of homosexuality and accepting a postmodern view of homosexuality?
That's right.
Am I correct?
That's right. If you go back to like 2005, he said that the notion of sexual orientation was a key thing in really promoting the homosexual agenda in America. The idea that people are born gay. Basically, if you accept this, you're giving up the farm, is what he was saying. Now he charges the church with homophobia, with a form of homophobia, that the church has lied about homosexuality.
I submitted a resolution to the Southern Baptist Convention for 2019. This was a different resolution. This one referred to sex abuse and said that there were 4 things that we should denounce. We should denounce non-disclosure agreements. We should denounce gentlemen's agreements. We should denounce what people call the 11th commandment, which is just the supposed biblical instruction never to criticize other Baptist leaders. And we should renounce retaliation. So I submit that resolution, and then I find myself in another hailstorm. And then Randy Stinson, the beady-eyed provost who had come from Southern, told me at one point, well, did you do this because we used the NDAs with all of the firings?
And you didn't even know?
I didn't even know. I said, I did that because of Harvey Weinstein, but now you're telling me that you are using non-disclosure agreements? Because
no wonder they're so sensitive. Yeah.
There's no biblical basis for a non-disclosure agreement. So all of a sudden, it all came to me at this point. that, okay, God has put me in the gap. This is what the way they are running things is against the Bible. The Southern Baptist Convention was being run by people who did not want sunlight on any of their problems. On top of it all, they fired me, and then I had secret recordings because I could see how they kept on changing everything and they wouldn't put anything in writing. And I knew that these people were playing dirty. Okay, so I had recordings, I had saved my documents, I released those to the public so people would know what was going on. And they released a statement claiming that I had made that up, that nobody had ever told me to avoid discussing homosexuality. They put that on the Southwestern Seminary website and they pushed that out on Twitter. They didn't know that I had the recordings. So I released those 2 days later. But the fact that they were going to go to such an extent of having engaged in the non-disclosure agreements, having distorted the curriculum, having tried to force me to give up my testimony and to basically participate in this falsehood about same-sex attracted Christianity, they were then willing to try to destroy my family, to drive me out of my profession, to ruin my reputation so I couldn't support my children and my wife, and they were going to do all that while claiming to be Christian. There is nothing Christian about this at all. I don't understand how anyone could even live with themselves. One thing I would say is to the people who don't want to come forward, if you're talking about the same kind of evangelical circles that I've dealt with, you're not clinging to anything real. Once people have figured out that you're not fully on board with their bizarre projects, they will drive you out. These are ruthless people and they're engaged in a ruthless game. And the only thing that will keep you safe is going to be to go totally public. That is the way to ensure the safety of you and your family. Because if you don't want to go public, then they get to make up certain portions of the story, and they'll make up the story so that you look bad. If you're clinging to this because you want a good reference letter or a recommendation from them, forget it. You're not going to get a good recommendation letter from them. They're going to write something privately behind the scenes to destroy your career. You just have to let the sunlight in to the whole issue. Your silence and your complicity is not acceptable. It's not pleasing to God. You know, if you're a student and you don't see how much power you have as a student at a Baptist seminary, you can shut that place down. If your parents write to that president, if you write to Al Mohler and say, we're going to go somewhere else if these things don't change or these things don't improve. If you don't see that and act on that power, then you've got some real tough news coming. If you can't stand up and resist when you're a student, you're going to become part of this machine forever. You're going to go to your grave just having been a company man, having gone along with what is historically significant as a huge downgrade in the church.